Hello students, this is your review on federal government exam on part 1. Okay, there are 50 questions. They are all fill in the blank or multiple choice. Okay, a government that recognizes no formal limits on the power of government, but yet still maintains some order through checks from other political and social restrictions, institutions, is called authoritarian. That's an authoritarian type of government. Okay. A system of government in which some wealthy financial individuals sort of control or run the government. That's called an oligarchy. That's largely what Russia has now. Why do we have a government? Well, the government provides basic services that everyone needs. Things like police protection, assistance when you fall on bad times in the form of things like food stamps or Medicaid, medical services, what have you. Americans' sense of political efficacy. Efficacy means a belief that government listens to the people and does the right thing. So efficacy, if there's a high degree of efficacy, that means that people are trusting the government. But a low degree of efficacy means that they are not. In recent times, the political efficacy has decreased dramatically between 1960 and now. Okay, which of the following best summarizes the history of citizenship and race in the United States? Well, there was a huge gradual expansion of citizenship to people of non-white descent starting after the Civil War because of the 14th Amendment, which said that anyone born in the United States is a citizen. Anyone who's born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a citizen of the United States by birth. Okay, less than 1% of people in 1900 trace their origin in Latin America and Asia. Less than 1% trace their origins from Latin America or from Asia. And most Americans of African American descent officially became citizens in the United States when the 14th Amendment was ratified. About 13% of all Americans are African Americans. The percentage of Americans over the age of 65, older people, has increased, but the percentage of Americans under the age of 18 has decreased. So the population is getting older, and that has impacts on government programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. The American population used to be heavily rural, but now is heavily urban. The essential documents of the American founding are the Declaration of Independence, obviously, and the Constitution. Those are the main essential documents of the American system of government. Three core values that we all believe in are liberty, equality, and democracy. Individual political rights are protection against the tyranny of the majority. That's why we have the Bill of Rights that guarantees protection against government oppression exacted by a majority to the disadvantage of minority. Okay, far fewer restrictions exist today on the press and political speech and individual behavior than in early years of the nation. So the nation has matured in that respect, that freedom has and liberty has expanded in those areas. Okay, equality, very few Americans believe in equality of outcome. In other words, no one is guaranteed success in life. However, we do believe strongly in equality of opportunity, equality of voting. Every person has one vote, and we believe strongly in that. And we believe strongly that everyone should have equal opportunity. Everybody has a shot at success. Majority rule is primarily ensured through the United States House of Representatives, because they are the representatives are elected every other year, and so they are considered to be the most in touch with the people. However, you have to consider with a grain of salt that statement because of redistricting. Redistricting, which is controlled by the majority parties in the various state legislatures, for the most part. Certainly that's true in Texas. And so redistricting allows a majority in the state legislatures to draw the districts to the advantage of their political party. And so that can skew this idea that the House of Representatives accurately reflects the views of the majority of people. One of the consequences of the lack of trust of people in the government is the inability of the government to recruit talented workers. In 1960, British tax and trade policies undermined support for the British rule among the colonial elite because of taxes. Now they wanted to repeal what was called the Tax Act. Now the Tax Act was a British tax, and actually it was a reduction of tax on tea. The British Parliament had been persuaded by tea merchants who had warehouses full of tea that they couldn't sell. They said, hey, we want you to reduce or just repeal the tax on exporting tea. And so they did. So what happened was boatloads of tea came to the colonies at a low rate because they didn't have to pay the export tax that they used to have to pay. That made the merchants very upset because the merchants still had a lot of the tea on their shelves, which they had bought from British merchants when they had to pay the export duty on taxes. And so the tea was expensive that they had on their shelves. Now here this cheap tea was coming in where the tea merchants did not have to pay the taxes, and they were upset. And that resulted in what became known as the Boston Tea Party, where merchants essentially dressed as Indians or Native Americans to shift the blame, try to shift the blame through a bunch of tea overboard. We all know about that. We also know about the Boston Massacre, which was a small number of colonists were murdered by British soldiers outside of the townhouse in Boston. After the American Revolution, the colonies formed the Articles of Confederation. That was in 1781. That was after Cornwallis, the British general, surrendered to General George Washington of the Revolutionary Army, and thus ended the American Revolution. That was in 1781. So the colonies had to have some kind of government. They had freed themselves from rule by the British, so they had to have set up some kind of a government. And because the British rule was rather strict and autocratic, they That was the parent that they got rid of. Well, they wanted a more lenient parent, so when they wrote the Articles of Confederation, it was not very strong. The colonies, now called states, were not very well organized together. The states had to implement the laws passed by the Continental Congress. There was no president, there was no standing army, and that resulted in a revolution by a guy named Daniel Shays in Massachusetts. He led a group of farmers to rebel against the government of Massachusetts, and that touched off some rebellions in other states as well, because there had been some poor yields of crop in recent years, and the farmers couldn't pay their bank notes, and the banks wanted to foreclose. Farmers did not like that idea. The heart of a farmer is his land. You try to take a farmer's land away from him, it's like ripping out his heart, and they weren't going to stand for it. So they got their pitchforks and their muskets and such, and they stormed the state court buildings and threw some judges out of the building. It didn't work. They eventually put down the revolution, but it didn't happen immediately because there was no standing army to come in and take care of the situation. However, democracy did work, because in the next election, some of these farmers ran for office. They got elected to the state legislature, and they were able to pass some laws which benefited the farmers and gave them a little leeway. It didn't forgive their debts to the banks. It just said, hey, the banks have to give them a little grace period. If there's been a bad crop, they had to, give them a little more time to pay their loans. The Declaration of Independence was very important because it asserted that there were inalienable rights from God, something that the government could not take away. The Virginia plan presented at the Constitutional Convention was a plan introduced by Virginia, and it benefited the large populous states, which Virginia was. Virginia was the most populous state and the largest state at that time. Well, of course, the small states didn't like that idea because they felt that the big states would eat them up, that they would dominate the new government that was being created. So they came up with a compromise. They said, okay, every state will have 2 senators, and there will be a Senate, and each state will have 2 senators, regardless of their population. But the House of Representatives will be based upon population and the amount of revenue that the federal government's getting from that state. One or the other, or maybe both. That was called the Great Compromise. The philosophy was shared principle among the founders was that power must be used to balance power. That's where we got the balance of power idea, that the branches of government are basically equal, 3 equal branches: the legislature, the executive, and the judicial. They each have a role to play, and they each have certain powers that the other branches do not have. And so they would tend to balance out. No branch of government would be able to exercise unlimited power. And the political significance of the Great Compromise was, number one, it did move the Constitutional Convention along, got it over that bump in the road, that stumbling blocking the road, so to speak. But also it tended to unify New England merchants along with Southern planters because they would have this not only the Great Compromise but the Three-Fifths Compromise. Three-Fifths Compromise was concerning the issue of slavery. What do you do about slaves? Do you count them when you are determining the population of your state for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives or not? And of course the northern states, the non-slave states, say, hey, you can't count your slaves. They're just property. You tell us that they're just property, so how can you count them? You don't count your horses and cows. Why would you count your slaves? So it almost dissolved the convention. It almost broke apart and was headed for failure. But somebody came up with a magic number of 3/5, and they agreed that, okay, you can't count all of your slaves, but you can count 3/5 of them, called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And of course, it sounds like a horrible idea today, but this was like, what, over 200 years ago. And so at the time, it was acceptable and it worked to move the Constitutional Convention along and resolve that issue, at least for the time being. Ultimately, of course, after the Civil War, the Three-Fifths Compromise was no longer recognized, even though it's still in the Constitution. It's no longer recognized or abided by. Ultimately, the Articles of Confederation failed because the national government they created was insufficiently powerful to deal with the crises of the time. The framers of the Constitution ultimately gave direct elected by the people the House of Representatives. In other words, it's the only it was the only office that was directly elected by the people at the time. Senators were not elected by the people. Excuse me. Senators were appointed by state legislatures at that time. Later, due to the 17th Amendment, senators became popularly elected. So now we vote for our U.S. senators, and that's how they are elected. But originally they were appointed by state legislatures. So they were not elected directly by the people. And of course, the president and vice president have never been directly elected by the people. They are elected by the Electoral College. Of course, the Electoral College is based upon votes by people, but it's not a direct election of the president and vice president by the people. It's indirect. The concept of judicial review, which is not found in the Constitution. We have a judicial branch. We have a Supreme Court and other courts, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says that courts can review the acts of Congress or state legislatures or administrative agencies to determine whether or not they are constitutional or not. There's nothing in the Constitution that specifically says that. However, the Supreme Court is in the Constitution, is established by the Constitution. The number of justices is not set by the Constitution. It is set by Congress. Today it's 9 justices on the Supreme Court, but it's not in the Constitution. Judicial review was not in the Constitution. However, the Supreme Court, in a landmark case called Marbury versus Madison, decided that, hey, if Congress passes a law that's contrary to the Constitution, we cannot enforce that law. We have to overrule that law and declare that it's not constitutional, it's not in compliance with the Constitution, or as we say today, unconstitutional. And that established the authority of the Court of Judicial Review. Only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election each year because the framers did not want, or they wanted to have the Senate as resistant to popular pressure. In other words, the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years, so the people get their voice heard every 2 years. But the framers were a little bit afraid of that. They said, well, there may be some radical ideas come as a result of that. So we got to have the Senate there to kind of slow things down, and only 1/3 of the senators are elected each year. There are in the Constitution the comity clause, which means that states have to respect each other's laws. And that has come into play on the question of, for example, recently same-sex marriages, because same-sex marriages were legal in some states but not in other states. And so a married couple who married same-sex in Massachusetts or New York or some other state that had legal same-sex marriages, they moved to Texas, and then they wanted to get a divorce. They went to court, and the court said, hey, as far as we're concerned, you're not married, so we can't grant you a divorce. So it ran into some problems. Of course, that was all solved by the Supreme Court in the case of Obergefell versus Hodges. That was in 2015, and that declared that same-sex marriages were legal, that was equal protection of the law to grant same-sex couples the same right to get married as couples of different sexes. Compared with the Articles of Confederation, federalism under the Constitution meant a greater centralization of power. And Congress has the right to create the court system. The Constitution only provides for the Supreme Court and other inferior courts which the Congress may from time to time create. So it's up to Congress how many district courts you have, how many circuit courts you have, etc. It's also up to the Congress how many justices you have on the Supreme Court. That is not specified in the Constitution. The framers probably intended the legislative branch to be the most important, and they gave them the power of the purse. All appropriations bills and all taxing bills have to originate in the House of Representatives. Actually, the Constitution says that all taxation bills, all revenue bills, have to originate in the House of Representatives. However, by agreement, all appropriations bills also have to originate in the House of Representatives. Okay, but the Senate does get involved in writing tax bills and appropriations bills. But if they pass something that's a tax bill or an appropriations bill and send it to the House, what the House does is they just change the number. In the Senate, bills are numbered with the letter S, like S-101. Okay, if S-101 is a tax bill and it passes the Senate and sent to the House, then the House just changes it from S-101 to HR, which stands for House Resolution, and give it a number. And so then it becomes originated in the House. In the ratification debates, there were two factions. There were the Federalists, who were in favor of ratifying the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who had some doubts about it. And we know that two important delegates from the Constitutional Convention, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, wrote a series of papers, essays, called the Federalist Papers, in order to convince the state legislatures to ratify the Constitution. So they were Federalists. Okay, Federalists were mainly property owners, creditors, and merchants. They weren't the sweaty masses, the laborers and so forth. Those were the Federalists, and they wanted protection. They didn't want another Shays Rebellion. They wanted protection. They wanted a strong federal government that could keep law and order, essentially. Okay, that's the conclusion of your review on the exam for Part 1 of Federal Government. Okay, you can take the exam at any time after the launch date, which is on your calendar and also on your videos of the day. And you can take it at any time. There is a deadline. Also, there is a time limit. You have to finish within a certain period of time. So you would, even though you can use your book to refer to, you can't look up every answer in the book because you'd run out of time very quickly. So, and also you cannot get any outside help on the exams. You have to do them yourself. You have to honor the honor system. Whereas on your inquisitives, you can get help from others. You can have your brother or sister, your older brother, your older sister that you think smarter than you help you out. You can work together with other students, whatever. But on the exams, you have to do those yourself. You have to show what you have learned. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening, and good luck on your exam. Thank you.